Have you ever heard of the time during World War II where Japan seized part of Alaska? I bet you didn't, because all this took place around the time of Midway, so that obviously took away all of its attention. Today we are going to be covering the forgotten battle of the Aleutian Islands. This battle was known as the Aleutian Campaign, and to sum it all up, Japan basically took part of Alaska for about a year. It was believed that Japan took these islands to distract all forces from Pearl Harbor and Midway, which is honestly believable for at the time. But I truly do hope that you stick around to hear the whole story. From what the natives on the islands and the soldiers on both sides went through, this story is truly heartbreaking. This conflict left physical and mental damages that still have yet to be fixed to this day.
Mast flags leading 500,000 marchers in the greatest
The year is 1942 and the war in the Pacific was still ongoing. It was at this point in time where Japan only had 4 aircraft carriers left. So naval operations, while still doable, were just a little bit more tricky. But even with these minor setbacks, Japan did not want to give up due to the Bushido Code, which is basically just a code of honor with a bunch of customs and values. But one of them was death was more honorable than surrendering. If you surrender, you are not human. Which that's a real thing. Like they would rather pick death over surrendering to keep honor. Guess that's one of the reasons why they lost, right? But you see, the Japanese had a plan. They thought of a potential way to distract American forces, mainly because they knew an attack on Midway was imminent. So, Admiral Yamamoto looked at some islands east of Japan and said, that's perfect. I mean, these islands were strategically valuable. It would distract forces stopping an attack on Midway, potentially draw troops from Pearl Harbor, and most importantly, give the Japanese a base closer to the United States. But anyways, Admiral Yamamoto saw these islands and he began his operation. On June 3rd of 1942, Japanese aircraft had descended upon the Dutch harbor, Alaska, making bombing runs first at 5:45 a.m., then at 7:34 p.m. The Japanese dropped approximately 70 bombs, getting hits on civilian houses and military ships. And baby boy, I hope you strap in, because you know how America feels about you touching their motherfucking boats. And although the damage inflicted was severe, the mental damage to the natives who have never ever seen modern warfare was bewildering. In response to this attack, the United States evacuated some of the natives, sending most of them to southeastern Alaska. And it was here where they were basically left with nothing. I mean, don't get me wrong, they were given food and water, but I mean, minimal food and water, and they were given broken down, rotting homes. Not only did they have to worry about rationing and the living environment, but they had to worry about the weather and the unfamiliar environment too. It was at this time where the population would dwindle. Out of the 881 people that were brought to these safe camps, 10% of them would never make it back to see their homes. Most of these people lost their lives to starvation or disease. Sadly, obviously the elders were first to go, and with them, most of their original knowledge of their original culture. United States Fish and Wildlife 1942 Correspondent SEAL Division was quoted as saying, "If you think any of this is fun, you should be here. The water system cannot, under any condition, be made usable for winter. The outdoor prives emptied into the water at high tide, but the sewage still washes back onto the beach for the children to track around. All houses have gone to rot." After bombing the Dutch harbor, Japanese forces were going to take Kiska on June 6th and Attu on June 7th. And the sad story of the people honestly continues. Most of the natives were either killed on the spot or taken back to Japan as prisoners. And I wish I could say it was all puppies, kittens, unicorns, and rainbows and they followed the rules of war, but come on, it's Japan. The environment of the ship was awful. The Aleutian natives were kept in dark holes, beaten, whipped, and starved. This was until they got to Japan, where I could assume that the environment was way worse than what was on the ships. The natives were even forced to learn Japanese or they would be killed. And I'm pretty sure I read this right, but at some point, the Japanese looked at the natives and said, "Who do you like more, us or the Americans?" And I'm gonna paraphrase when I say this, but the Aleutian natives looked at the Japanese and said, "You're kidnapping us. They protect us." What do you think? Japanese even tried getting military information, such as when the ships leave and arrive, and even the military activity on the island, but the natives really didn't say anything. I mean, come on, dude. Even after all that abuse and torture and confusion, they didn't say a thing, yo. Olin Prokopov was quoted as saying, "We were taken aboard a ship and we were on our way. My house was opened and burned. We were taken out of the ship when it was dark, and because of our ignorance of exactly what was happening, we were very anxious. All during the voyage, we were kept in hold, which was very unpleasant smelling. And it was also dark. We never once saw daylight until we reached Japan." Now on Kiska, it was about this time where Japanese forces had established a garrison, submarine docks, and artillery for defense. But the weather on the island was very hindering. slowing the progression of the Japanese forces. By July 1st, 1,200 naval troops and war materials had finally been placed on Kiska. At the height of it all, there was about 6,800 troops on the island at once. In response to this invasion, on June 11th of 1942, the United States Army would conduct bombing runs on Kiska up until 1943. It was here where the Allies would continuously bomb that island, day and night at random times, dropping over 6 million pounds of bombs on or near the island. But this wasn't easy. You see, many Americans lost their lives due to anti-aircraft fire or enemy interceptors. The weather was a big problem as well, making visibility limited and making most bombing runs ineffective. But let's leave the island and come back in a bit. You see, the bombing runs were effective enough to have reinforcements being called. Under Admiral Yamamoto's orders, troop resupply ships were being sent to Kiska. But here's where it gets worse for the Japanese. On March 26, 1942, those reinforcements would be attacked by Task Group 16.6. Task Group 16.6 was comprised of the USS Salt Lake City, Enterprise, the Hornet, the Nashville, the Vincennes, the Northampton, and was commanded by Rear Admiral Charles H. McMorris. Task Group 16.6 aboard the USS Salt Lake City would successfully land hits on the Japanese heavy cruiser, the Nachi. While sustaining damage of their own, Task Group 16.6 would successfully make the Japanese convoy comprised of the heavy cruisers, the M.I.A. and the Nachi, along with the light cruiser, the Abukuma, retreat. Now Yamamoto knew an attack on Kiska was imminent, and instead of making a final stand on the garrison, he just evacuated it all. The evacuation turned out successful too. So successful, in fact, that by the time the Canadian and the American forces had landed on Kiska, they were met with no resistance and abandoned buildings. But again, the Americans didn't know that this island was abandoned, so while sweeping this island, more casualties happened than anything. In fact, over 100 casualties were reported due to friendly fire while sweeping this island. But this raid was technically deemed as successful, so the Canadian and the American forces started setting up shop. That was that for the island of Kiska. Pretty easy, right? Wrong. Now it's time for the island of Attu. Now on May 11th of 1942, American forces, aided by Canadian forces, would bomb and shell the island of Attu and even deploy 12,500 troops to the northern and the southern edges. Once on the island, the troops would be met with heavy resistance, such as gunfire, sniper fire, and even banzai attacks. For the next 2 weeks, both sides would make little progress. Lieutenant Donald E. Dwinnell was quoted as saying, "It was rugged. The whole damn deal was rugged, like attacking a pillbox by the way of a tightrope in winter." And I bet that you said the worst part of all this would be them fighting, and I would be inclined to believe you if I didn't know the weather of this island. But you gotta remember, it was either freezing, raining, foggy, or snowy, or all the above. And do not forget about the 120 mile per hour winds. This weather made it nearly impossible for supplies to come to the island, and it even made it harder for the medevac to come to the island and heal the wounded. The ironically sad part about this all is the weather killed more people than the Japanese soldiers did. Like, I'm not joking. 2,100 soldiers were reported to die due to the weather, while only 1,700 were reported to die by Japanese hands. And by no way, shape, or form am I trying to diminish this number. I'm just trying to show you how severe this weather was. Death, regardless of what causes it, is tragic. One of the best ways to keep warm on this island was to keep moving. You could not stop or you would freeze to death. Captain William H. Willoughby was quoted as saying, "The ones who suffered were the ones who didn't keep moving. They stayed in their holes with wet feet. They didn't rub their feet or change their socks." Now remember how I said we stopped the Japanese reinforcements? We also stopped their cargoes, so the Japanese forces weren't doing too great either. After a while, American forces became real hungry and real aggressive and started to overrun Japanese positions. Dr. Paul Tatsuguchi, who was an American-trained Japanese medic, wrote in his diary on May of 28th, "Ate half-dried thistle. This is the first time I've eaten something fresh in months. It is a delicacy." But now the Americans were starting to make more progress. With food and more supplies, they could continue pushing on. And that they did. In the evening hours of May 28th, American forces occupied the high ground in Chinkoff Valley, now controlling 3 critical hills: Fishhook, Buffalo, and Engineer Hill. This in turn forces all the Japanese forces back to the shores, making them easier targets. It was at this time where the Japanese are really struggling. At the time of the American landing on May 11th, the Japanese had over 2,600 troops. Now, they only have 800 combat-ready men. But again, not wanting to give up, Colonel Yamasuke, who was an officer at the time, planned to attack the Allied soldiers at their weakest and take the artillery on Engineer Hill. And this is the sad part. It's at this moment where I can heavily assume that the officer at the time told all the people who couldn't fight to kill themselves. This is because of Dr. Paul Nebu Tatsuguchi's sad final quote. The last assault is to be carried out. All the patients in the hospital are to commit suicide. Only 33 years of living, and I am here to die. At 1,800 hours, took care of all the patients with grenades. Goodbye, Takai, my beloved wife, who loved me to the last. War is hell, man. I mean, this is truly sad. If you could fight, you had to fight, and you couldn't surrender. And if you couldn't fight, you had to kill yourself or be killed. Back to the Americans. On May 29th, Company B of the U.S. 32nd Infantry received an order to march to the battalion headquarters to get a hot breakfast. And this alone is a treat. I mean, getting a hot breakfast in a battlefield, let alone what's practically an Arctic tundra. And see, this moment, this is when the Japanese decide to attack. Most of the American forces ran back to Buffalo Hill, and the soldiers who didn't were left with the artillery on Engineer Hill. It was at this point where the Americans on Engineer Hill were fighting for their lives of not only them, but their brothers. You have to understand, if the Japanese get a hold of this artillery, it's done for the American forces. I mean, there's many things that they could do to combat it, right? But you can't get artillery from the ships if you can't even see the shores, right? How the heck are you supposed to see a hill? But they're sitting here fighting, they're lobbing down grenades to the people who are farthest. They're doing hand-to-hand combat if the Japanese are getting real close. And this fighting ensues all day. There was multiple attacks, like there wasn't just one, there was multiple. Finally, at the end of it, the American forces came out as the winners. Finally, taking back Atu and taking back the Aleutian Islands for good. I do believe that those soldiers on top of that hill that day made a very big difference in that battle. Because had the Japanese got a hold of that artillery, a lot more bloodshed would have been reported. Most of what was left of the Japanese forces were either killed in the final attacks or ended up killing themselves. After cleaning up most of the battle, the Aleutian natives would finally get to return home, and guess what? Most of them were left with nothing. You gotta realize, it was a war zone, so nothing is gonna stand. The Americans, for the most part, did help the natives, but refused to build smaller communities on other islands, and basically told the natives just to move to where it was more populated. But that, ladies and gentlemen, was the forgotten battle of the Aleutian Islands. One of the many forgotten battles during World War II. I really do hope you guys check out the links if you guys are interested, because it tells you everything, and I mean everything. So feel free to fact check me or add additional information if you guys so please down below in the comment section. Thank you all so much for watching. Yo, you guys all have a good day and a good night. Thank you to all my veterans. Y'all stay safe. Peace.